Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the DCC Guide. Today we're going to start a new project, one that I wanted to do for quite a while. And this involves some track work, scenery work here on the Piedmont Southern. And what I'm going to show you is how you can make track that looks like it has been covered in grease and grime from diesel fuel leakage and drippage from the bearings on steam locomotives, oil and water from all of these different locomotives, as well as some ashes dropping from the steam locomotives. And this type of track is perfect for areas around a diesel fueling facility, around a roundhouse, around a coaling tower for steam locomotives, and ready tracks for both steam and diesel locomotives. And if your railroad runs a lot of excursion traffic, then you're going to have locomotives sitting around dropping oil and grease and ashes and everything else while they're waiting for their next excursion run. And the same is true for your steam and diesel locomotives that are waiting for the next run on the railroad. So let's go ahead and get started with how you can go about producing this grimy, greasy track on your model railroad. Now, the inspiration for this approach comes from a modeler in the UK, actually, and named Chris Navard. And Chris is a regular contributor to Model Rail magazine. He's a professional modeler, photographer, and he also builds layouts on consignment for individuals. And one of the techniques that he uses is what he calls Grotty track. And Grotty is a slang term in the UK and some other English-speaking countries, and it is short for grotesque. So that'll give you some of the idea of what Grotty track looks like. And basically, it's just gritty, grimy, dirty track produced from a couple of different things. And the approach that he uses is based on the fact that during the steam era, a lot of cinders were produced as a result of all of the coal that was being burned in the steam locomotives. And they had to get rid of it some way. And they typically used it on yards. They would ballast the entire yard area with cinders, and the same thing for a lot of sidings. And there were a number of railroads that were actually ballasted entirely with cinders. Now, one of the problems with cinders, though, is they don't hold up as well as regular ballast, which is much, much harder typically. And as a result, it has a lot of fines in it. It gets ground down, and you end up with sort of a slimy slurry, particularly where you've got oil and grease droppings mixed in with it. Now, the approach that Chris uses is based on the use of a product called DAS or DAS modeling clay. And this is a type of clay that air dries, so you don't have to put it in a kiln to cook it and dry it. This stuff will just dry in the air in just a couple of hours after it is applied to your tracks. And I'll be showing you exactly how I go about doing this, and I want to thank Chris for the inspiration for this. I'll also be showing you how to add some other details to the track, including ashes, which typically, would be dumped in an ash pit. However, when a locomotive is just sitting around waiting for its next run, it's going to also drop some ashes from the grates and from the firebox and ash pan. It just happens as a result of the fact that they have to be constantly fueling these locomotives and keep the boiler hot while they're waiting for their next run. In addition, all of these locomotives are regularly oiled, their bearings and the like, so you get drippings of grease and oil coming down onto the track, and that all mixes with the cinders, and it creates sort of a slurry on the track, so it looks very greasy and grimy looking and slimy. And so that's the effect that I want to achieve. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so this area right here on the Piedmont Southern in Monroe Yard is where the Norfolk and Western's big passenger steam locomotives, they're J-class 484s, sit on the ready track waiting for a southern train to come in that they need to pilot across N&W territory. So we always have a steam locomotive sitting right here on this section of the ready track waiting to go out. And as a result of that, you're going to have an accumulation of cinders that build up. Although they don't dump their ashes and cinders here, you will get a certain amount that's going to sift out from the fireboxes over a number of years and build up in this area on the track. Also, because of all of the grease and oil that drips off of the bearings and everything else on locomotives, you're going to get some greasy areas down in here as well. So you're going to have that slimy, greasy buildup on top of the cinders. You're going to have ashes build up in this area coming out of the fireboxes, ash pans, and grates on these steam locomotives. Also, this area in here will be a temporary waiting track for the Southern Railway switchers that go out and do their business, adding or taking express cars and dining cars, things like that, off of these passenger trains or putting them on, as it were. So you'll have the switcher sitting here in this area typically, and so you're going to have a buildup and accumulation of grease and oil coming off of that switcher. And occasionally you'll also have one of the passenger diesel locomotives that is taken off of the train going south and move into here so that the N&W locomotives can move out and take over the train and head south with it. So you'll have an accumulation of grease all in through and oil on top of the ballast all in here. So we're going to want some greasy, oily track in through this area here, this entire area, some oil and grease up in here, and cinders down in through this area. And what I want to do is start off, I'm going to get all of these locomotives and cars out of the way, and I'm going to apply cinder ballast down through here. This right here is what I use, Woodland Scenic's Fine Ballast Cinders. So that goes on the entire section of this track here and in through here. And I'm going to keep it down lower than the top of the ties, because when I start adding all of the other products in here to give it that greasy, grimy, oily look, that's going to take up some space. Also, when I put in some of the ashes, that's going to raise the level as well. And we don't want, coupler pins and things like that to be catching on buildup like cinders and ballast and ashes and that kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to start the way I normally do and just spoon in some cinders in here. And I want to keep it kind of light so that it does not overflow to the top of the ties. Okay, so that's about like what I want it to be, right there. And we'll put in some here between the tracks as well. And on this second track back here. And we'll catch a little bit of the ties here. And I want to get this area here around the water column taken care of as well. Okay, that looks pretty good coverage. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to go over it with my wide brush. This is about a 1/2 inch wide. And then I'll just sweep the excess down into the area between the ties. Try to get that smoothed out, leveled out as best possible. And then I like to use this fan brush to manipulate flat areas, because If you try to use the wider brush, the stiffer brush, you end up creating piles, whereas this tends to flatten things down, and you can get things out from in between the ties. Now, another thing you can do to kind of level out and knock ballast down into place is to just tap lightly with the end of your brush on the rail heads. And the vibrations will tend to settle the ballast down between the ties and off of the sides of the rails themselves. Now, before I apply any ballast cement, I pre-wet the ballast with rubbing alcohol. This is 70% rubbing alcohol. And what that does, it will soak into the ballast, pre-wet it, and knock down surface tension so that the ballast cement that I use will soak right into it and give you a nice even gluing of the ballast, so that you won't get just the surface ballast being glued down. And why do I use rubbing alcohol as opposed to using wet water? Basically, the rubbing alcohol will evaporate overnight. I'm going to take and put a small fan on this down here, and it's going to be evaporated, and the cement will be hard and dry so that I can finish this video tomorrow. Now, if you do this, if I did this with water, it might take a couple of days before it's completely dried out, particularly right now in midsummer when the humidity is up. It can take a while for ballast to dry out if you use wet water to pre-wet your ballast. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I've got a small dropper here that I use. These are disposable pipettes that I bought 1,000 of them off of eBay one time a few years ago, and I suspect these are going to last me the rest of my life and into somebody else's. So let me go ahead and get started here. Okay, so I just want to take it and go along the edge of the ties and allow a small amount to come out. And you can see a wetting front forming where it's flowing out away from the edge of the ties out to the edge of the ballast. That it's going to flow in also underneath of the rail and into the center section. And it's a good idea to keep your area that you're working in ventilated with some sort of fan. Otherwise, the fumes from this alcohol, you might get a little bit lightheaded. One time I was working up on the upper deck and did not have a fan going. And before too long, I almost fell off of the stool I was standing on to do that because of the fumes. Came near being overcome by them. So you can see the center is fairly well saturated just by the wicking effect of the alcohol moving under the rails and getting into that fine cinder ballast. And once it starts to get wet in there, you can apply a little bit on the inside as well, like this. Okay, so now I'm about ready to start applying the ballast cement. And for that, I make up my own ballast cement, as I've shown in a previous video, with 1 part, I said matte medium here, it's actually Mod Podge that I'm using today, plus 3 parts water and 4 drops of dishwashing detergent. And that's, again, to help break up the surface tension of the water so that it's going to flow into the ballast itself. And it's very important with this very, very fine stuff, when you're working with it, that you use the alcohol and the 4 drops of detergent in here in order to get that glue to go down into the fine ballast and work its way in there and give you a good solid set of ballast. Okay, I'm going to shake it up real well and get it ready. And do the same thing as I did with the with the alcohol. Go ahead, get my little pipette and drag it along the top of the ties here so that it will go down in there and saturate all of that cinder ballast. And you can see how it's going down in there. It's moving right down into the fine cinders. And you can see how those are starting to turn kind of milky white in there as the glue starts to move out and fill the voids between all of those little pieces, those little particles of cinders. Okay, that pretty much has it all ballasted. So what I'm going to do now is set up a fan here to blow directly on this area of track and get it dried. Before we go on, I want to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's simple, easy, and free. All you have to do is hit that little red subscribe button, and when the little bell comes up, click on it and click all. Thanks now. So the next step in the process is to take this DAS air dry modeling clay, and I'm going to smear it on the top of the ties throughout this entire area. And then I'm going to press it down in between the ties. So what we're going to get then is an orange mess, really, but it's going to allow me to create that fairly smooth surface that you very often see in association with areas where you get a lot of locomotives sitting around and a buildup of grease and water and all other manner of things. And it gets all into the ashes and cinders that are in here between the ties. So let's go ahead and let's get some out. You only want to work with a pinch of it at a time. And basically you're going to just take it and put it on top of the ties like this and smear it in. And work it down in there. It's fairly straightforward to get this stuff worked in here because it does just go down in there between the ties. And I'm just going to work it on down in here. All in through here, because this is where the diesels are going to be sitting, and on the back track is where all of the steam locomotives are going to be sitting, waiting for their next trip. And you can get this DAS clay from Amazon. I ordered it from Amazon and it arrived in just a couple of days. And it comes in either white or this terracotta orange color. So I went with the terracotta, assuming that if I ever have a breakthrough and some of it gets exposed, it's not going to look all that bad or different from the red clay soil that we have in a lot of this area. Okay, so there you go. That's the way it's supposed to look. Now, the next step in this process is to take a nice short stiff brush. This was originally much longer, it just got cut back. And I'm going to take this and use it to press the excess down in here between the ties, and also to clean off the inside of these rails. And then what I want to do is just come back and hit the top of the clay with the brush. And that will give it a nice stippled effect. So it's going to give it the look of the cinders in the ballast. So you just want to work it like that. One thing I do like to do, I just take a little, this is a cotton swab with a wooden stem, and I've sharpened that to a little bit of a point there. And then you can just take something like this and run it along the inside of the rails and clean out the web of the rail like that. There we go. And I'll do the same thing on this side. You can just run that in there and clean that channel out between in the web. And then I'm going to go back and try to pick up some of that and get it down into places between the ties that I've missed. And you can wipe any excess off with a paper towel as you go along here. Just do the entire length like this. This also works to tap it down in between the ties. And I'm going to go ahead off camera and repeat the process here on the edges of the ties on the outside of the rails, so we get that area filled in too, because they tended to pick up a lot. Now, at least while it's drying and before it sets too hard, I just take a piece of broken cork roadbed and run it along the top of the rails, and it does a nice job of cleaning off any of that material that has gotten up there. And I like to do that as I go along instead of waiting afterwards. Well, that's a wrap for today's video. At this point, we've gotten the tracks completely ballasted with the Woodland Scenics Cinders product, and I've applied a layer of the DAS modeling clay throughout the section of track. And that gives us that nice greasy, slimy look that we want for these tracks. So on Friday, when we continue this modeling project, I'm going to apply a couple of coats of black paint over that orange DAS clay. And that's going to give us that nice black, oily look that is so common on these locomotive holding tracks. And after that is dry, then we can go ahead and do some dry brushing to bring out some more of the details and add a little color here and there. And then finally, I'm going to apply the piles of ashes that escape from the ash pans and the grates on the steam locomotives, plus we'll be adding a few strategically located piles of sand, because these train crews always check their sanders before they go out on a job. And that requires releasing a little bit of sand to test those sanders. And as a result, you'll have little piles of sand on these holding tracks. So come on back on Friday and we'll complete this project, and you can see how you can add Greasy, Grimy, Grotty track to your model railroad. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll see you here on Friday with that video. Bye now.